Most plane hijackings take place on commercial airlines. Think of incidents like the 1976 Entebbe raid, the D.B. Cooper hijacking in 1971, or the tragic events of September 11th. The idea of a cargo jet being hijacked is practically unheard of. But on April 7, 1994, Fedex Flight 705 would change that forever. The date is April 7th, 1994. Fedex Flight 705 is about to depart from Memphis International Airport to San Jose, California. On board were 3 experienced airmen, Captain David Sanders, First Officer Jim Tucker, and Flight Engineer Andy Peterson. Additionally, a second flight engineer, Auburn Calloway, is jump seating, a common practice that allows employees to hitch a free ride for personal or work-related reasons. He brought with him a large guitar case, but none of the 3 flight crew members bothered to check it, a mistake they will soon regret. Before the plane even takes off, the pilots already begin noticing things out of the ordinary. Firstly, Calloway was seen in the cockpit of the plane when the crew first arrived. This was unusual behavior for someone who's meant to be jump seating. Then, as the flight engineer Andy Peterson was making a pre-flight inspection, he noticed that the circuit breaker for the cockpit voice recorder, or CVR for short, was pulled out. The CVR is a crucial piece of equipment for any aircraft, as it records all audio in the cockpit, giving investigators insight into what happens during a flight. Peterson brushed this off as just another minor oversight and quickly turned the CVR back on. Little did he know that it was intentionally disabled by Calloway, who wanted to prevent leaving behind any evidence of the flight. After takeoff, Fedex Flight 705 climbed steadily into the skies over Memphis. All seemed routine, but the calm would not last long. Calloway was waiting quietly for his time to strike. In his guitar case was not an instrument, but sets of hammers and a spear gun. When the plane had climbed to an altitude of 19,000 feet, Calloway began preparing his weapons. At this time, the crew were having a casual conversation in the cockpit, completely unaware of what was going on behind their backs. Calloway begins to make his move. His plan is to use the element of surprise and incapacitate the 3 men. Without warning, Calloway struck Flight Engineer Peterson, severing his temporal artery and knocking him out temporarily. Before Tucker could react, Calloway had struck him too, sending shards of bone into his brain and temporarily paralyzing him. At this point, David Sanders had just begun to realize what was going on. With both of his colleagues seriously injured and unable to move, he was their last hope of fighting off the hijacker. As Calloway focused his attention to his last remaining target, Sanders' survival instincts kicked in and he began struggling with his attacker, buying time for the rest of the crew to recover from their injuries. Due to resistance from Sanders, Calloway is forced to retreat to get a spear gun. As Calloway stepped into the cockpit for the second time, he would quickly realize the blunder he had just made. By giving time to the crew of Flight 705, he had lost his element of surprise. This time, the 3 airmen immediately fought back against Calloway. Peterson, who had now regained consciousness, lunged at Calloway and grabbed the spear gun, preventing it from being aimed. Calloway struggled to wrestle free, but Peterson held on, using his body weight to keep the weapon away from the others. Sanders joins in and helps in restraining Calloway. However, both men are severely injured and losing a lot of blood. If this continues, they'll eventually be overpowered by Calloway. Knowing the dire situation, Tucker makes a risky and desperate decision. Despite his own injuries, Tucker knew he still had control over the plane's flight systems. He reached for the controls and abruptly threw the aircraft into a steep 15-degree climb. This pushed the 3 wrestling men out of the cockpit and into the galley. Tucker hoped that this violent maneuver would catch the hijacker off guard and make it hard for him to maintain his assault. The abrupt movement of the plane threw Calloway off balance and allowed Peterson and Sanders to keep him restrained. Following this, Tucker began rolling the plane onto its side, hoping that would further disorient the hijacker. The DC-10 was rolled almost a full 180 degrees, pinning the 3 men to the ceiling of the plane. Despite having been thrown around by Tucker's erratic maneuvers, Calloway was still actively fighting back. He managed to free one of his hands and hit Sanders with a hammer. Sanders was then hit again, nearly knocking him out. Peterson wasn't doing much better as he was still suffering the effects of his ruptured temporal artery. It wouldn't be long before he went into shock. In the cockpit, Tucker was facing his own set of problems. The right side of his body was starting to become paralyzed from brain damage. Additionally, the plane was currently in a nosedive and traveling way beyond the speed it was designed for. The wings and elevators began to flutter, and Tucker could hear the air rushing against the windows of the cockpit. In this compromised state, the aircraft became incredibly difficult to control, and if it wasn't pulled out of the dive soon, he might lose all control of the plane. He notices the automatic climb throttle had been left on since takeoff and turns it off, decreasing power on the engines. Then, he slowly pulls out of the dive, making sure to be careful as rushing this process could damage the tail. Miraculously, he succeeds in stabilizing the plane and takes the chance to radio Memphis International Airport.
Aircraft with emergency, say again. Express 705. I've been wounded. We've had an attempted takeover on board the airplane. Give me a Victor, please. Pass to Memphis at this time. Hurry. Listen. Hey, center. Give me a heading to Memphis.
In the back of the plane, the fight between the three men continues. Thanks to Tucker's maneuvers, Sanders manages to get a hold of one of the hammers, allowing him to incapacitate Calloway. Hearing that Calloway had been disarmed, Tucker puts the plane on autopilot and goes to check on the men. As he is severely injured from the initial attack, he tells Sanders to take the hijackers' weapons to the cockpit and fly back to Memphis. Sanders knows that he has to land the plane fast before Calloway begins to regain his strength. He notices that the fuel tank is too full, but the switch to dump it is too far away. Despite receiving warnings from the computer system, he decides to land the plane, knowing he has to make it to the airport before Calloway becomes too strong. Although the runway has almost 1,000 meters more than what the plane normally needs to land, the excess fuel in the tank could very well cause them to crash. The plane is only meters above the ground now and still traveling at almost 400 kilometers per hour. The computer warnings continue to blare as Sanders could do nothing but hope that the extra 1,000 meters would be enough. Somehow, with only 300 meters to spare, the plane lands safely. With help from emergency services, Calloway is arrested and the three crew members are given immediate medical attention. Despite pleading temporary insanity, Auburn Calloway was sentenced to life in prison with no parole. Subsequent investigations revealed Calloway had planned to stage a plane accident by crashing the plane after taking out the three crew members. After a failed marriage and threats of being fired from his position as a flight engineer, Calloway decided that his only hope of ensuring financial security for his family was to die in a work-related incident for $2.5 million of insurance money. Thankfully, the crew of Flight 705 were able to put a stop to his hijacking, saving the plane and the lives of those on the ground. They all survived their injuries and were given the highest honor of heroism by the Airline Pilot Association. However, none of them would ever fly commercially again.